Welcome to this week's episode of Moving Forward Talk with Diana. I am your host, Dr. Diana Clark. This week we have Minister Michael Isaac. It's a pleasure to have you, Minister Isaac.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. And when I grew up, I wanted to be a doctor as well. I'm very delighted to be sharing with you this evening on your program. Congratulations on this very useful program, and I'm very sure that it's already creating an impact in the minds of young persons who might have thought that by virtue of their humble beginnings or by virtue of the absence of a parent, whether it's the father or mother, or that significant role model in their lives, they can't make it. As your program suggests, it is very clear that there are some of us who have made it, quote unquote, by virtue of, although I should say, not having the kind of parental guidance in some respects. I'm delighted to be on your program. And as you rightly said, I'm supposed to introduce myself. My name is Michael Isaacs. I was born in the parish of St. Anne, Jamaica, and that's in the Caribbean. I attended primary school, secondary level. I was educated at the University of the West Indies, where I did a number of courses. I graduated from the Caribbean Graduate School of Theology with a master's degree in business administration. I've served on a voluntary basis in the church for pretty well over 40 years. I also had the opportunity of serving in corporate Jamaica in what one might refer to as high-profile companies. Industries included the print media, retail, and distribution. And I also spent the greater number of my years at the management level in the financial services industry. I think it was between 2010 and somewhere about 2018, I served as adjunct faculty at the University of the West Indies, at the University, Caribbean, that's NCU, Northern Caribbean University. Wow, bit of lapse there. And a number of other tertiary level institutions, particularly in Western Jamaica. So I've had a little bit of exposure here and there, and I've been able to share with voluntary organizations where I volunteered in community organizations, I should say, and served at the leadership level for a number of years. So I'm very delighted to be sharing some of those experiences with you. And as you mentioned earlier in a previous discussion, I want to be sharing as best as I can the impact of my mother on my personal life. My dad was not around to have shared in my early upbringing. In fact, I say sometimes that I am very grateful for his contribution. I saw him 3 times in my life. And my mother, according to a book of that title, My Mother Who Fathered Me by Edith Clark, she was the person who was my mentor, my model in early life. And to this day, I celebrate her precious memory.
Awesome. Very awesome. And as you know, to our audience, this platform is open to discuss various topics with the goal to motivate others to shape their future without limitation. And as Minister Isaac mentioned, we're going to be discussing the importance of fatherhood, and as well as how not to allow the lack of having your father in your life, not to allow that to cripple your future. So, Minister Isaac, the first question that I have for you, you have introduced who you are from the elementary school up. before then, give us a brief synopsis of your upbringing.
Okay, my mother and father apparently went their separate ways when I was probably about 3 months old. So I was taken by my grandmother from about age 3 months until I was about 5 years old. So I recall my early years, and I have memories going back to uh, possibly about 3 years old when I lived with my grandmother. And she also had she has had a very lasting impact on my life as well. And I recall growing up with her, obviously from very humble settings.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was there, so I knew from early that uh, I would have had to take on roles of responsibility from very early years. So I lived in St. Anne with my grandmother, and then later on, about age 5, I joined my mother in South Trelawney, Jamaica,
Mm-hmm.
where I entered the primary school or the elementary school level. And from then onwards, I was guided by my mother until I was probably about age 14, 15 when I transitioned to another city, that was Montego Bay, to complete my secondary education. And at that point, I basically was living on my own, and I had to just simply take care of myself. But what was very important for me, what was my guiding light then, were the fundamental principles I learned from my mother, a keen sense of self-awareness. She made sure to have taught me very early
Mm-hmm.
that I'm a man. And she was growing a man who, in Jamaican language, was not going to grow up without being of some use to society. So
Correct.
she taught me some sense of value. I had household chores like any other child in any other home. I didn't grow up with my siblings. Life was extremely difficult. My mother had uh, 5 children. One died very early, and the other children grew up with uh, their father's relatives. In fact, my mother unsuccessfully made 2 or 3 attempts to give me away to strangers because she was fearful that she would not have been able, as a single parent, a single mother, to provide all the necessary resources that I would need to grow what would have been, in her estimation, a balanced life. But looking back, I think she did an excellent job. I was taught a sense of responsibility. I was taught values. I was taught to be accountable. I was taught to be responsible for myself, my appearance. And one of the interesting things is that I remember on several occasions I went home with objects that she did not provide in the first place, and I had to account for it. And wherever there was any semblance of doubt in her mind, whatever time of the evening it was after school, I had to return with that particular object and take it back to where I found it, or to whoever had given it to me.
Awesome. That's an awesome story. And I can relate, of course. I can relate to some of what you're saying, being raised also with my grandparents. My dad and my mom split as well. And I saw my dad a few times for the very first time when I was almost 16 years old. And then I remember traveling back to Jamaica for a vacation. I went to see him about 3 years, 4 years later. And probably another time right before he passed away, he was very ill. So I took the time to go see him. So I probably saw him somewhere there 2, 3, or 4 times. So I can relate. In being raised by your mother, how did that impact your ability to father your children? And I ask that question because sometimes it appears to be like a generational cycle. You have men to say, I wasn't raised by my dad. I wasn't taught how to be a father. So therefore, I don't know. And then they also neglect their responsibility of being a father. How did that impact you?
Well, I grew up with a very keen sense of awareness that my dad wasn't there. One of the interesting things I reflect on, even in adult life, is that my mom never made me feel less than.
Right.
He never cursed my father or said unpleasant things about my father in my presence. And so while I was very well aware that my dad wasn't there, I didn't feel less than. And to answer your question directly, it would have been a good thing if my father was there. But one of the interesting things, or a couple of very interesting things which compensated or filled that gap, is that my mother was a godly example of values. She embraced the Christian faith. And so I had no choice but to go to school, irrespective of what I looked like. One thing for sure is that most times I had something to eat. There were days when I was hungry nonetheless, and there was just no food in the house. But I had to go to school. I had to go to church. And my mother insisted that I read. I learned to read very early. I joined the library. And even into the teenage years, adult years, I read a lot. And so my exposure into the church, my ability to read, and I think in early life, I read quite a bit, I think. And so that compensated for the gap considerably. As I grew up as a young boy, there were male figures in the church who were sort of role models for me. They were my mentors. And even in early adult life, many or most of my friends were much older than I was. And even to this day, I still have much older friends to whom I'm pretty close. So there were a lot of men in the church who were role models for me. So they sort of filled in for my father. And my reading also provided considerable information on not just about fatherhood, but how to be a man. So the absence of my dad, I don't think that affected my ability to have been a good father to my sons. And I say this advisedly because in the final analysis, they are the judges. I have 3 sons and I'm married. My wife is Joan. And I have had the distinction of hearing my sons talk about their father personally and in conversations with others.
Right.
And one of the greatest things I've heard from my sons is, in fact, my eldest son, Caril, he said to me one day, we're having, I think, a very intense conversation. And he said, look, you're probably not aware of this, but I do not regard you as my father. I regard you as my friend. And that for me was one of the greatest compliments I could have had from my sons. And my other 2 sons, Michael and Jonathan, they, not in the same words, but they have expressed similar sentiments in terms of how they regard their father. So the absence of my dad in my life was recognizable from the standpoint that I obviously knew that he wasn't there. Did I miss my father? Sure, I did. But I think looking back, my mother did an excellent job. And whatever I am today, I give credit to her. And whatever errors, mistakes, and whatever rough edges there are, I do not hold her accountable for them.
Talking about not holding her accountable, have you ever gotten to the point where you held your dad accountable for not being there?
I have, I don't know, I would want to call it strong regrets. Mm-hmm. But chances are, if my dad was present, chances are life could have turned out a little different. For example, there were several days in my early life when I didn't go to school. And that was simply because my mother just didn't have the wherewithal. I started working, earning monies to go to school from as early as age 11, 12. I recall working on construction sites, working at a bakery, doing gardening, doing odd jobs. My mother also, in addition to being a domestic helper, she found time to do farming, a little farming here and there, and no big farm, of course, peasant farming. And once she reaped those produce, it would be my responsibility to take those to the streets and sell them. And no wonder I think I did pretty well at selling and sales management. And so I had responsibility for taking care of the business side of things. So if my dad was there, I want to think that there would have been a stronger economic support. I didn't go to the traditional high school because my mother didn't have the wherewithal to facilitate early preparation to transition into that sort of situation. And so I think from that regard, life possibly could have been different. But looking back now, I'm very grateful for the way she did it. Mm-hmm. And I also was taught by her that I had to partner with her in my own development. So I have absolutely no regrets, notwithstanding, as I said before, life possibly could have been different with my dad being there. But not to brag a little bit, and if it sounds like I'm bragging, then to my mother goes the credit. And this is regrettably so, that a number of my peers who had both parents at home and who grew up in what you would refer to as a normal family setting, mother and father, brothers and sisters, they had the necessary wherewithal. They were always present at school. Unfortunately, some of them fell by the wayside, and I deeply regret that. Mm-hmm. And it goes to show that it's not necessarily economic stability, but a grounding in a sense of responsibility, strong values, and we cannot discount the importance of the Christian faith.
That is very well said. And I also tend to believe, and that is my belief, is not gospel, but I also tend to believe that the more struggle we encounter in our early years is the more of a driving force for us to become stronger, for us to change the mentality. Because to me, it's all about changing the mentality. I'm not going to forget where I came from, but I'm not going to have it in memory as a hindrance to me. But I'm going to remember, and I'm going to keep moving forward, because I don't want to remain at the same level. So because I don't want to remain at the same level, even I don't want my children at the level that I started. So then that struggle paved the path for us to become stronger, to move forward, and to achieve certain things, certain successes in life.
You mentioned the whole idea of the early struggles that a lot of us Caribbean um, persons go through, and indeed, struggle is universal.
Right.
I am indebted again to God. I'm indebted to my mother. I'm indebted to the church. I'm indebted to so many other persons who contributed significantly to my own development. And one of the very interesting things is that there were men and women too in the community who expressed this sort of confidence in my capabilities. And I'm so very grateful for that. But I'm not sure I would want to exchange my my development, the context in which I grew up for a more palatial um, upbringing. Chances are I probably would miss some of the lessons that I learned at the University of Hard Knocks.
Absolutely. And I know you have read my book, and I think I allude to that. Would I want a different life? You know, and I'm paraphrasing now. I mean, I want to have experience some of the stuff that I did experience, but I wouldn't change that upbringing.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And we learn so many valuable lessons. And one of the very interesting things, I'm blessed with 4 grandchildren, and already I'm seeing a sense of personhood, a keen sense of value, a keen sense of self-awareness in my 10-year-old granddaughter. She's simply amazing. And the others, one of which is a little older and the other 2 are younger, already I'm seeing where my sons have been able to pass on some of these values to their children. And that's very important. The quality of life is not necessarily in the abundance of things that we possess and or the kind of palatial setting in which some of us grew up or some of us didn't grow up. It's all about, as we said before, the whole sense of value. Learning to live, learning to understand who we are, whose we are, what we have, and where we're going.
Because, and just to add to what you just said, where we are going, as my grandmother would always say, it's not where you start. It's definitely not where you start, but it's your finish line.
It is indeed. One of the things that I credit my mother for is that in addition to helping me to understand who I was and my circumstances, despite the fact that, well, despite the fact that we just didn't have it, I didn't know that we were poor until I was probably about age 10, 12. I just did not know until I started to have a different kind of understanding when persons who were more privileged than we were sort of made it very clear that I didn't belong in their grouping. And unfortunately, there were some parents of my friends who made it very clear that they should avoid me because I would lead them astray. Now, apart from the few childhood or boyhood mischiefs that I did, I quite frankly didn't think I was that mischievous for them to have said that. And it gave me a sense of inferiority. in my early boyhood days until I started reading more and more, and then I began to possess a deeper sense of self,
Right.
which my mother also stimulated, encouraged, and I think it has blossomed out very well.
And exactly, when we figure out who we are and who we want to be, another quote from my grandmother, and I'm sure a lot of people use that quote, is not the name. You can be called so many names. It doesn't matter which name you're called, it doesn't matter to which name you answer.
That is so right. And I had quite a bit of that in early life. But again, it goes back to the sense of self, the sense of focus, which was instilled in me by my mother, my reading, and also there were a number of persons who acted as role model, and I think I was pretty focused. Of course, I wasted a lot of time as a boy growing up, but those times also taught me some values, I think, and I'm the better off for having gone down that road.
So we are getting closer to our time frame here, and I'm going to ask this question, and it can be a okay, don't lost my train of thought. This can be very controversial. Often often absent parent or absent father is measured with the negative impact. From your perspective of not having your father, are there any positive impact that you can think about?
Oh, significantly. Early, I learned to be responsible. I took responsibility for my behavior. And to this day, even being a grown adult, I think I learned leadership very early. I had several instances where obviously my dad wasn't there, and it was my mother's responsibility to see to the growth and development of this boy. And in many instances, I think I was kind of mischievous, but not, as we say in the rural parts of Jamaica, a bad boy per se. But there were instances when we were playing together as boys, something went wrong, and my mother would pull me aside and give me a serious thrashing for that, because her words were, I should have known better. I should have taken charge of the group. And I'm saying to myself, how under God's heaven could I have done that? Well, she said, well, you know better than the rest. You should have demonstrated leadership. And so I can't really say that my father's absence was absolutely negative. There were a number of positives, and my mother helped me to understand very early that I had to take responsibility for myself. And that positioned me in very early life for leadership positions. I remember at least 2 major corporations in Jamaica, I was the youngest member of the management team in my early 20s. So my dad's absence worked for my good.
Now, we have heard and time again of research, and one of the most commonly used theories that is used to measure risk factors that will lead us into the criminal justice system is the theory of the social bonding theory and the social learning theory. Both theories combined together shows that absentee father or even fathers with criminal history, children tend to end up in the criminal justice system as well, or it end up being a generational cycle. Now, how can our young men avoid becoming a part of that generational cycle or become a part of statistics?
I think it goes back to the biblical principles that it is the father's responsibility who is supposed to, this is the father's responsibility to grow the child, and the mother provides the support system. Where the father is absent, it can produce some serious challenges. But the truth be told is that there has to be early grounding in the whole upbringing of the particular child, particularly of boys. And it is extremely difficult for a mother being single parent to grow up a son. It's probably easier for her to grow a daughter, but I'm sure it's extremely challenging for her to grow a son. And the research is probably, no doubt, absolutely correct. But I'm here to say there are exceptions to the rule, and I'm one of those.
And and that is why I really wanted to touch on that, because there are exceptions to the rule. And I stand to be corrected if I'm wrong. But to me, it's not because the lack of the parent, and it's not the father with the criminal history. Yes, it influences and it play a part, but our influences does not determine our destination. So I strongly believe in being accountable for one's destiny or for one's action.
My mother taught me that very early, and I recall on several occasions while I lived with her up to about age 14, 15, one of the things she repeatedly said to me was, and these older folk had all kinds of proverbs, all kinds of sayings which communicated the message that they wanted to get across. One, she said, look, when others are quote unquote jumping on 2 feet, you make sure you jump on one. And so she has always said to me, you've got to understand who you are. And number two, the day you leave my house for school or wherever you are and get into trouble, don't even bother to call me, because I won't be showing up. And I loved her dearly, and I understood what it meant to have her support. And so therefore, I walked away from trouble. And very often my friends used to say, I'm a sissy. I was a coward. And I said, well, this coward will go home and the rest of you can stay and get into trouble.
So you were taught to be responsible from an early age.
Oh, yes.
And to also that your accountability is yours.
Indeed.
And thank you so very much for sharing. And the message we are trying to send here is, regardless of the lack that we didn't have, regardless of the early beginnings, regardless of even some situations now that we are going through, it doesn't define who we become, and it does not pave or totally determine the path for our success.
I totally agree with you. And our circumstances will not always dictate a particular outcome. In fact, years ago, I learned that ideal circumstances do not always guarantee success. And irrespective of our circumstances, once we get a clear understanding of who we are, whose we are, what we have, and where we're going, I'm sure that could be a guiding light in the dark.
There's always a guiding light. Now, is there anything that you want to share that I failed to ask?
Well, I think we basically have covered it, irrespective of our early beginnings, irrespective of our circumstances early in life, despite the fact that they do play an important role in influencing the individual we become in later life. A bad start can always be corrected. Right. And as a person of faith, I believe that the power of God provides that medium for transformation.
Absolutely. And sometimes, I don't want to say I question it, but it is said, the Bible said the Lord would not give us no more than we can bear. So even though the struggles were real and we have yet to understand, or I have yet to understand some of the struggles or even the reasoning behind it, but I know I could bear it. I didn't think I could, but I could bear it because he's not going to give us more than we can bear. And then what I use now as my daily instruction for my life is trusting the Lord with all my heart. And I try lean not to my own understanding, but in all my ways, I acknowledge him and I ask him to direct my path.
Indeed. I totally support that. One of the things that I've learned from my mother is a keen sense of courage, determination, and focus, and a clear sense of what I wanted to become. And to a large extent, I have achieved most or all of the things I've ever set out to do. Notwithstanding, I will remind myself that what I have done, what I have achieved, pale compared to what I'm capable of doing for the future. And so we can no longer look back at the things we have done, look back at the things we have achieved, but look forward to even greater accomplishments. But I certainly want to pay tribute to my mother, who fathered me, the greatest father I've ever known.
And moving forward, what is next on your professional or personal life moving forward from here?
I'm beginning to listen to, well, in fact, I have been listening to my friends who suggest that I should go sit in a classroom again. I've always been a student of continuous learning, and maybe I should consider very seriously taking on that in a more advanced way, having completed the MBA maybe more than 10, 15 years ago. And also, I would like to make a difference. I am contemplating the formation of a not-for-profit organization because I believe that I have enough influence to speak with a couple of persons who might have the wherewithal. I'm making myself a channel through which we could, channel some of these resources to other persons. And my dream, and this is not just a cliche, is to make this world a better place than I found it.
And you will, and you can.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us and Moving Forward Talk with Diana. And until next week, remember, nothing is ultimately beyond you.
Thank you.